Hey there, everybody. Scott here, and welcome to the latest episode of Grey House Literary Agency educational videos. Today, we are going to be talking about demystifying romance and women's fiction. I wanted to bring this one to you because I think that this is an area that I think a lot of people get confused over, and especially people who are brand new authors who maybe think that they're writing romance or think that they're writing women's fiction. This is something that here at the Grey House Agency, this is all we focused on. When I opened up the agency in 2003, our big emphasis was to say we're going to focus on romance and women's fiction. And a lot of people looked at me and said, you're crazy, Scott. I mean, give me a break. Why are you just focusing in only on these two genres? Why don't you expand, make things bigger? And I'm thinking, why? Why do we want to make things bigger when this is a genre that is at the top of most mass sales out there in terms of fiction? It's right up there with the mysteries and the thrillers. Romance is right up there. It's you've got readers out there who are reading 3 to 10 romance novels a week. There is a lot of money that's going into this industry, whether it's even traditional or self-publishing. But we do want to demystify this a little bit and kind of talk about really what romance is and what women's fiction is. I definitely want you to make sure you're taking notes on this one, paying attention, and obviously if you want me to come out and talk to your group, your writing chapter, a little bit more on these topics, I'd be more than happy to do that, especially if you are watching this and you are part of just a general fiction group. This is an awesome workshop, so I can give you some more details. This is kind of that modified version. So let's go ahead and let's move on. First of all, there is a rationale for knowing what your subgenre is, and I think a lot of people run into this problem. Writing is about marketing and product placement, especially now that we are into a self-publishing model where people can just publish their own books. You have to know which little buttons to click so that Amazons and places like that know where to put your book under their algorithm sections. Positioning is everything. This is a great line. It comes from Anderson in 2011, but positioning is everything in publishing. Where that book shows up at, when that book shows up at. If you know people who are into the romance genre, there are certain times of the year that it is the best time to have your book coming out, and that's positioning, because we know people buy books then. It's also knowing where you're going to target your submissions, right? We don't just send your manuscript out to every single place. You as an author need to know, I'm going to target only certain places. But if you don't know what your own subgenre is, you're going to have some problems. Obviously, it's going to reduce your chance at rejections. I hate writing them. You hate receiving them. Let's find a way to fix this. But it also allows you to clearly be able to talk about your writing in terms, in verbiage, in that vocabulary that everybody understands. Now, I'm showing you this particular glimpse here to a thing that came off of bookcountry.com. I did just take a look at this one recently, and a version of this. But with this particular thing, it did require like Flash Adobe type of things, and it wasn't working last time I checked, so maybe it is. But it came off of Book Country, but I think you can clearly see by this map how many different subgenres there are, and you've got to be able to pinpoint those. So I'm just going to show you down here in the romance section, right down here in the bottom, you've got, 7 different potential areas on those romance genres, and now we have Regency here, but we can also expand that. We've now got Victorians, World War II, World War I. So a lot of those things are starting to expand a little bit more. But if you don't know which of these boxes your story falls into, you've got a problem. So we want to make sure that we're going beyond that point. Know your genre. Now, let's talk about some common problems that people have when it comes to submissions of any type. People are submitting projects that lack that house or agent's voice. Now, this is a key thing, is that each publishing house has a certain tone to it that if you pick up a book from, say, HarperCollins Avon, it's going to sound different than something coming from St. Martin's or something from Pocket and New American Library or Source Books. It's going to sound different. But if you were submitting a story that doesn't match that voice, you're looking at a probable rejection there. You're looking at, obviously, submitting projects that people don't represent. I get this a lot of times. I would say half of the submissions that I get are from people who are submitting projects that aren't romance or women's fiction. So that's a big problem. Mislabeling your project. And it goes to the wrong person. So if you think that your story is a romantic suspense, but when in reality it's just a historical but not a romantic suspense, it's going to get sent to a slush pile at, say, an agency. The agent, whoever's reading it, is going to go, oh, it's a romantic suspense. Send it off to that person. And then that person's like, dude, this isn't romantic suspense. It's historical. It's going to get a rejection. They're not going to just keep passing this thing back and forth. So we want to make sure that you're not mislabeling it. People also believe that their the story is good, and and publishers and agents change their marketing plan. So there's some people who start to submit stories and then they blame it on, oh, publishers and agents aren't doing it. No, maybe the problem is your writing's not good. So I'll be very honest. We have to deal with that one. And it's also, another problem is showing the editor or agent that you don't understand. So when you start submitting things, if I look at a query letter and that query letter says, I'm really new at this, I really need some help, you're going to get a rejection because we're going to sit there and go, it's not our job to teach you how to write here. So we want to make sure on those. Okay, so let's talk about why we categorize writing, because there's a lot of people out there who say, I don't want to categorize my writing. I don't want to be put into a box. But let's look at these, right? In architecture, we've got Doric and Corinthian and Ionian columns, right? You can't say, well, mine's sort of a Doric, Corinthian, Ionian combination. It's one or the other. So when we look at those structures, each of these structures here have a specific style. Same thing with music, right? Baroque and Renaissance music might be somewhere around that same kind of period of time, but they are different. Same thing with literature, right? If it's naturalistic or romanticism, it's got certain characteristics. So that's why we want to understand those. Now, how do we figure these things out? I'm going back to the basic structure. We've all seen these things before. And this is the plot structure format. But I want you to think about this. If you have to tell your story with just this line right here, you focus just on that line, that starts to pinpoint what your story is about. Where a lot of authors are muddling things up is that they are sitting there trying to tell this story, but then they're adding in all these other pieces around it, all those subplot pieces, and secondary and third characters and things like that, and that's what's confusing things. So we have to always come right back to this same basic plot structure that's going to help you out. Now, let's talk about common myths about romance and women's fiction, because that's really what we've talked about here. So, common myths. I have a romance in my story. That makes it romance. Nope. These are myths, obviously. So we want to understand. We're going to go beyond that. Well, there's a relationship. It's in a romantic setting. The characters get married. Or this is the big one. Well, my characters are having sex, so it must be a romance. Nope, not it. Now, let's look at women's fiction. Again, a common flaw. Well, I have a strong female protagonist. So? That doesn't mean that you're, in women's fiction. It's written about women. So? There's no happily ever after. See, the key is, in romance, and we'll come back to this one, romance has a happily ever after. So they say, well, everybody dies, so therefore it's women's fiction. Nope, doesn't do it. Well, I didn't put sex in it. Nope. Or it's written by a woman. None of those things work. Okay? So let's move on. Let's talk about what romance really is. This is the part that you've all been waiting for. When you deal with romance, romance is about the relationship. That the relationship is that central story arc. I was thinking about this morning as I was coming home from the grocery. I was thinking about this when you talk about somebody who's been married for like 75 years, they go, this is a true romance, right? What are they focusing on? They're talking about the relationship that's going on. That's the key thing. that there is a happily ever after. That is one of those requirements that if it doesn't have that happily ever after, it's not going to be a romance. So that's one of the key pieces. Now, that's not the only thing, but if you're missing that one kind of knocks you out of the park. So there is a happily ever after. We want to know when we close that book at the very end that they're going on, that there's not going to be problems, that things are in good shape. They might have some bumps, but they're in good shape. The focus is primarily from a female perspective. Now, that doesn't mean that, okay? But most of the time, that's what we're seeing. Now, we're in an LGBTQ plus arena right now. So obviously, we can have male-male romances, female-female romances. This is your standard traditional one that you often see. So I want you to be clear on this one. It doesn't have to be that one, though. The story is about human nature, though. Let's move on. Let's get to the big part. It's about human nature. It's about watching that relationship build literally from nothing to everything. And yes, there can be subgenres, right? So it can be a historical romance or a romantic suspense, or it could be a rom-com, right? Fantasy romances, right? There can be any of those subgenres. So know that you can expand on it. But we have to go back to that central story arc, right? That central story arc says that the focus is on the romance. The focus is not about that subplot. What romance is not about? It's not just about those sex scenes, right? That's not it. That is not going to put it in there. So I want you to understand, if you write romances, you can write a sweet romance with absolutely no sex scenes in them. So there's that whole range from just tender, inspirational type of romances all the way up to the really hot and steamy ones. Romance is not, there's a happily ever after, so therefore it's a romance, right? Again, we already talked about that one. There's a relationship in it that has a romance. That doesn't mean it either, okay? So I see a lot of people doing a fiction story and then they put a relationship that's sort of building in it. But if the focus is on that, the not the relationship, but the storyline, then that's it. A lot of guys, I'm going to tell you, guys, not to throw you under the bus here, but a lot of guys think if they put it in a romantic setting, it becomes a romance, and that's not really it. So I want you to understand that that's what it's not. Keys to making your story a romance? Figure out how you want to build the relationship. You notice we're bringing back that chart here. How do you want to build that relationship? You know where you got to get to. Think about topic versus thesis. So what I mean by this one is the thesis is this end point right here. The storyline of how you're getting to this point right here. Topic is like... it's a story about a guy and a girl, and they're figuring out who they are. That's a topic. We want to know the thesis. What's our goal here? Everything that happens in the story supports the romance. So if you're doing a suspense piece, any of the suspense pieces are there to support the building of that relationship. I want you to also think that these are real relationships. Okay, now when I say real, this is not nonfiction. These need to be characters that we would see on a regular basis. That's what a real romance is. Okay, so when we can relate to those characters, romance and women's fiction, it's about the reader connecting with that author and that author's voice. So we have to make characters that are truthfully believable. Make sure that you do have a happily ever after and it's realistic, right? We want to know when we close that book, we have got to that happily ever after and everything's there. And remember, sexually explicit scenes are not necessary. So I cannot stress this one enough. You can write very tame, traditional, sweet romances, what we call those. A lot of those Hallmark stories, that's what the Hallmark movies, the Christmas movies, right? That's what those are focusing in on. Now let's talk about women's fiction. Here we go. We're going to shift on over. In women's fiction, the focus is on the female journey. It's where we are going to. Being able to understand the world through the female eyes, right? It's most likely going to be in a female point of view. And the reason that we bring this one up is because we're looking through that lens. Your ultimate goal is to understand what it is to be a woman in the world. What it is to be female. There doesn't necessarily have to be a happily ever after, although I will tell you, a lot of people really want that happily ever after at some point. We want to feel good by the end of a book, not completely depressed, but we do want to really see that vision. Doesn't have to have that romance or sex scenes in it, but they should have, and this is the last piece right here, readers should leave with a sense of learning something about who they are. The thing about women's fiction is that after you finish reading a book about women's fiction, you want to talk about the ideas in it. You don't want to talk about the book. You want to talk about the ideas of what you learned, what you gained, how you grew as a reader. That's the key thing. Again, now let's talk about what women's fiction is not. Just because it has a female protagonist doesn't make it women's fiction, so we got to make sure about that. I added no happily ever after, so that works. Nope. No sex scenes. There's no relationship. It's something a woman would want to read. All of these things don't make it women's fiction. Okay? So I want you to be really clear on those. Keys to making your story about a women's fiction, I want you to think about that theme or the message here. Again, we're looking right back to this chart right here. What's that theme or message? What is it that you want us to learn? Is it learning about being able to live on your own after being in a marriage where everything else was controlled by maybe the husband? And now this person has got to learn to just be independent. Maybe that's it. So think about that. All things in the story are seen through that female lens, so we want to really focus on that piece. This is a tough one, guys. I'll be very honest. This is a tough one of why guys really struggle writing women's fiction, because they already don't look at the world through the female lens. So being able to tell the story through a female lens when you don't have the female lens, that's the problem. Don't muddle the story up with all this extra stuff. Okay, so adding in all these little subplots and problems isn't going to help you. Remember, your thesis is that theme or message that we were focusing in on. That's your theme or message. That's the thesis. So everything needs to be pointing towards that. Don't just add in other conflicts. This is also character driven, not plot driven. So if you tell me about your story, I want to hear about the growing character, not all the events that are happening in there. Add a romance if it's necessary, but again, add those sex scenes if it's necessary. If it's not, just putting it in there is not worth it. And again, these have to be realistic. Women have to be able to relate to it. Actually, any reader has to be able to go, I can connect with this. I fully get this idea. So that's going to be the key thing there. Key is know your own genre. Okay? Make sure you figure out what that central story arc is. Go back to that chart. What is it that you talk about the most? When I sit down and talk to authors during conferences and they're pitching to me, first of all, I tell people that they don't get to read their note cards because they're shaping it what they want it to be. I just say, talk about your story. And talk about your story and then listen to what you focused in on. Whatever you started focusing in on, that starts to shape what your genre actually is. And you cannot force your story to be something that it's not. Okay, so I want you to be very clear on that. Your story is one genre, you got to be able to figure out what that one is. And you can't say, well, it's fantasy, romance, historical. No, pick one. You got to focus in on that element there. But definitely make sure you know your genre. Now, that's it. I know it's a lot of information. You're probably going to want to go back and watch this one a couple other times. I want you to remember, I'm going to leave you with this one here. It's Ray Bradbury's line, right? You fail only if you stop writing. And I don't want you to stop writing. I want you to keep working, keep growing, keep learning, okay? If you like this, make sure you subscribe to this. Remember my comment here, now that we've really been starting this up, when we hit that 1,000 subscriber, any of those subscribers are now open to a potential at least 6-month mentorship with me to help you out as an author. It won't be working with the agency. It'll be working just directly with me. So I'm not representing you, but I can certainly work with you. Make sure that you reach out to me over on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Come over to the blog. That's over at the Blogspot, Scott@blogspot.com. Come over there, read those blog posts. Definitely make sure you visit my website. If you are a member of a writing chapter and you want me to come and talk to you, talk to your group, I can do this virtually. Now that we're opening things up, you know something? I can fly there, spend a weekend, meet with your group, talk about various different things, listen to pitches, you name it. Let's keep going. Remember, though, you only fail if you stop writing. I will see you out there, and make sure you subscribe here, people. Make sure you subscribe. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.